Jed, great to see you as always, and thanks for making a bit of time to come and have a chat with us about what you're doing. It's the thing that really interests me about what you're doing is that you're working in an area that is very well known to founders, but you're doing things in a very different way, which I think is really interesting. So thank you for being willing to come and have a chat about it on the channel. So just to kick off, tell us. Let's start. Tell us about your ambition. What is it you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, Paul. Well, firstly, thank you for having me and for reaching out in the first place. I appreciate that you're taking an interest in the mission. So what am I trying to achieve? I think for relevant background, I'm somebody who's learned venture investing, been an angel investor through balance sheet capital, which I've always found to be a little bit of an unintuitively stupid way to learn venture investing because it's
Okay.
effectively like saying going to the casino to learn to play poker against the house. Unfortunately, it's very common. This is the
Yeah.
default path.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what I do want to achieve is to help people who are interested in this space approach this as a craft to learn the game and to maximize the odds of success. And I think when we do that, it's doing a service not just to those individuals becoming sophisticated and savvy investors, but it also ends up helping founders just because
Yeah.
there's just going to be more investors out in the world that they could potentially connect with.
Yeah. And of course, that's something that we need more of. So it seems to me to be a pretty good proposition from that perspective. The more of that we have, the better it is for everybody. Um, Tell me about the moment when you thought this idea could translate into what you've created, which is essentially a global business. I mean, just tell us about that moment.
I don't know if there was a if there was a singular moment or a catalyst that lit a light bulb. Everything really has been an evolution. You know, I have always approached things in terms of, okay, what seems to be directionally correct, and look for the data points along the way, right? You know, and I think that's the universe giving you signs, right? I'm not a superstitious person, by the way, but I think, you know, just looking at for data points as directional indicators, it's the world giving you a path. Like there's something there and you've got to follow those breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
And so my process has always been evolving from one step to the next, right? I started out as an angel investor, learned the craft with balance sheet capital, had some initial success with some early deals I ran. And that gave me conviction to say, okay, I'm ready to take the next step. Right. And I did want to scale up and I set my sights on building an investor network, you know, not unlike your angel network that exists. These exist all over the world,
Mm.
except that I realize that these organizations, by and large, are fairly inefficient and some are indeed very broken.
Yeah.
And it seems that this cannot be the sum total of human intelligence, that this is the best that we can operate. And so the question is, what does good look like? And it's really been the last 5 years of experimentation and development that I think really have like developed my own playbook and processes for doing this at scale.
Okay. And when you realize that this could be something that can be delivered at scale, I mean, that's one of the things that separates it from most of the kind of more localized angel networks, isn't it? I mean, you've delivered it at scale. What when you started to do that, what was the kind of crux problem that you needed to overcome to achieve that goal? I mean, just talk us through how you saw that when you were early on in the journey.
Sure. Now, when in what we do, operating an investor network effectively, you need multiple pillars, right?
Mm.
In fact, three pillars, and the difficulty of it is that they're all dependent on each other, right? And it presents a bit of this chicken and egg problem, right? One is you've got to build an investor network to back your deals. You've got to go out, find companies, and be pretty good at the diligence, the decision making part of it.
Mm.
And then the third part that stitches everything together, which is, I think, very commonly overlooked, is, how do you have like good processes for doing this? Um, and so for me, it was, I guess, recognizing each of these discrete pieces and then figuring out which to solve, right? And I indeed approached it in that 1, 2, 3 order in the way that I described. And so I think it's a much more nuanced topic than most investor groups give this credit for. They sort of go, okay, I need to build an investor network. I need to find deal flow and full stop, right? There's actually a lot more
Mm.
that's required to bind this together.
Mm. And in terms of how you've branded this, I mean, you call it the Angel School, which implies, if you like, a bigger emphasis on learning how to invest rather than just being an investor. I mean, just tell us about that perspective.
Sure. So I built up my own investor network and became very successful at raising capital and backing companies. Right? I essentially went from writing 10 or 20K angel checks to immediately writing six-figure checks into companies, and that scaled very quickly. And we even got to mid six figures, even seven-figure checks. And so there was clearly something there, right? Because there's nothing in my profile that says I should have an unfair advantage
Yeah.
in doing this. And yet
Yeah.
here I was, right? And I don't see this as a matter of ego to pat myself on the back, but the data points speak very clearly for me. And so then it must mean that something here is systematically working. And so it became this experiment of like figuring that out. I think that process made me very cognizant of like the decisions that I was making, right? And I think it gave me a lot of clarity on, oh, actually I did A, B, and C, and this is why it worked, right? And that really was the genesis for Angel School. The question was now, okay, if this is systematically working, let's prove that it's not some special magic thing that Jed can do and nobody else can this be replicable and repeatable? And if it is, then I want to prove that because I'm not particularly worried about hogging that information or to keeping it to myself. And so that was the genesis of Angel School. The question was, how do we help empower other investors to also do this?
Mm.
And so everything that I do teach, it's it's exactly from what I practice, right? If I don't do it, I can't teach it because I just don't
Yeah.
believe in it. I'm just not that kind of a person, right? I just don't have that.
Yeah. Yeah, and let me ask you, are there any particular things? I mean, when you present that story, I mean, it sounds very logical, sensible, rational, and I'm sure it is. But are there any particular things on that journey that have kind of pushed you out of your comfort zone a little bit?
Um, yes, I think there's a certain, probably some of the things that we will discuss, in today's like call is in what does it mean to build a business and to be a
Mm.
CEO and things like that. Excuse me a second. Um, and I've always held this worldview. One is that I'm a fairly paranoid person. Like I don't like to be in
Right.
situations of having dependency on something else, right? I don't like situations being thrust onto me, right? Which has always been my personal hangups about the traditional career corporate path,
Yeah.
right? That, there's politics.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
just a cog in a machine, right? And I've always, because of that, as long as I've had a job, always side hustled and worked on something else, right? Because I wanted to have a safety net. I think over time that has evolved, right? As I started to see that what we're doing is working, then the question became, how do you turn this into a real business, something that is commercially viable and stands on its own, right? And I think that's a much better position to be working from, right? Because you're motivated by positive forces. I think it's good to have a balance on both, to be clear. Some degree of paranoia is good.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned about, and I share this thing about being a cog in a bigger wheel when you work for another company. I mean, what about the flip side to that? I mean, what is it? I mean, because, building a business can be a bit of a roller coaster. There are good days, there are bad days, there are things that work,
Very much
don't
so.
work.
Yes.
I mean, what is it that motivates you to to kind of to ride that roller coaster?
Yeah. For me, it's personally it's this sense of like progression,
Yeah.
right? And whatever I'm applying myself to, I feel that we're evolving and learning and we just keep pushing the boundaries of not just progress, but also how efficient that we can be in doing this. It's not for everybody, I will say, because building a business is incredibly hard and incredibly lonely. I think for some strange reason, I'm just like psychologically wired to be a bit of an outlier in terms of lone wolfing things.
Mm.
Um, and it's not for everybody, but it works for me, right? I'm very comfortable in that uncertainty, right? This is another maybe a mental model or
Mm.
view of the world, which is that for most of us that we live in developed world, we are fairly comfortable. I do believe that our risk thresholds actually come down,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? In that our perception or sensitivity to risk goes way up, such to the point where we stop ourselves from doing a lot of things. Like a lot of the risk that we're faced with is I've tried something and it failed and I feel kind of lousy about it. All right, that's psychological risk and not really existential risk, and that's the way I've always had that calculus in my mind. I think the other thing is any particular problem that I apply myself to, I'm looking to win, right? And you can win in a field that is well established, and that's like winning the 100-yard dash in the Olympics, right? We're talking about beating by hundredths of a second,
Mm.
and you've just got to be perfect and on form. I think the other way to win is working in an environment of uncertainty, right? Because human nature and a lot of us are just not very well equipped to cope with uncertainty.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
things happen, we
Yeah.
stop and assess and let things stabilize. And my view has always been, okay, in that situation, if you can trudge forward, as difficult, uncertain, as painful as it might be, you can actually make a lot of mistakes and still be way ahead of the competition because
Yeah.
everyone by default is standing still. And so, I've always thought about comparative advantage from those points of view. And so my point is in my particular field, I consider myself excellent and world class. Like, I mean, and I don't say that lightly. And a lot of it is because we make conscious decisions on how we want to approach things, and a lot of people are choosing to go down the conventional path, right? Which basically means that you've just really, really got to be very, very good at what you do.
Yeah. And I mean, when you talk about dealing with things like uncertainty, I mean, I learned to deal with that as a result of being a mountaineer. I mean, when you're out in the mountains, the weather changes quickly, there are avalanche risks, I mean, all that other stuff, which is, if you like, almost unknowable. I mean, you can't predict the weather much beyond a few hours, really, in the mountains. I mean, is there anything in your background or your identity that enabled you to kind of develop those characteristics that help you deal with that uncertainty? I mean, is there something in your background that has led you to
Yeah.
that, do you think?
I don't know, right? I do think about that question, like, is it nature or nurture, right? Maybe there is a part of me that is hardwired to be able to deal with risk. I mean, I have had, truthfully, certain episodes in my life that were difficult,
Yeah.
right? And in those situations, one of them was actually during my undergrad days. Family wasn't in very good financial shape, and I actually had to work through uni to pay the bills and to pay for school fees. And I think I developed some level of mental resistance to that, right? I was like literally working 40 hours a week on top of a full course load
Mm.
during the semester. And then during the summer break, I just like ramp up to 60, 80, even 100 hours a week. It was like as much as I could get. And I mean, situations like these, I think some of these episodes in your life, just when you have to dig deep, when your back really is against the wall, and this is where you find out where your metal is.
Yeah. I mean, it's that saying is that, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, doesn't it? Um,
That's it.
and are there things that you absolutely stand for? even when things get tough? I mean, are there particular sort of core values that are important to you?
Um, yeah, I suppose, I take very seriously like my dealings with people,
Hmm.
and acting in a prudent way or
Yeah.
in an ethical way. And so to the extent that I can, everything that we build, even when things get tough, right, I make sure that I have guardrails for myself such that I never am tempted to act in a way that I wouldn't want in normal times. So an example of this is when we look at deals and we push it out to our network, and we're trying to do a good size raise. Let's say call it $250,000. Um, and you've got a target against that. I really don't like hard selling deals, right? It's just not in my nature. I think the deal itself should make the argument. And so, um, one thing that I always do is like we're trying to build our investor network, right? Because the bigger it is, the more numbers that you have on your side. And so these things take the pressure away from like having to be in a position where, gosh, I gotta hit this number and now I've got to like be a bit pushy. And I don't want to act like that. Right. And so I think a lot of it is it's not just like the core values and principles that we want to conduct ourselves by. It's also what are you doing to be not, to not be in that position in the first
Yeah.
place.
Yeah. Yeah, and that position that strengthens your position as the CEO as well, doesn't it? If you've got those guardrails and you know, as it were, what's in and what's out is that's quite important. I totally get that. Let me ask, let's just go back to the business for a second. I mean,
Sure.
you talked about the journey that you've been on. I mean, just talk us through in a bit more detail how that has evolved as you've picked up people from more jurisdictions. I mean, I know you've got members from all over the planet. I mean, has that process of picking up people from around the world changed the way, I mean, has the business evolved as a result of those sorts of things?
Yeah. The business has evolved, and I do feel like we're building momentum. Right. So just to like step back, let's talk about the major pieces. And then I think the really interesting bit is like where we've built in network effects and flywheels
Mm.
to grow. Okay, so there's effectively two parts to what I do. One is I've got my investor network. You can think of it as an angel network. And there we are 1,400. I think by next week we'll cross 1,500 investors. We've written like seven-figure checks into startups. Uh, that particular network at scale, we know how to operate it very, very efficiently, right? So to be clear on that, I do that myself. I have literally no team, and I spend $60 a month managing on my tech stack to manage that side of things.
Mm.
We've also figured out a um, referral flywheel, which means that today my investor acquisition is completely inbound. I actually do not spend time looking for
Right.
new investors because the existing network refer new people into me.
Okay.
The other part of what I do is the education business, right? We run programs formally for investors. They either want to learn angel investing or they want to build angel networks and run syndicates like I do. So we run the programs. And what I say to these investors is you finish the program, I invite you to join my investment committee, right? Because we've created this forum now where after they've learned something, they can apply their knowledge. So that's the model. Okay. So just let's abstract this and just talk about it purely as a business. On the programs, we it's a for-profit business, so we monetize from the programs and we make money there. When we do deals as an investor network, we do make some fees
Okay.
on every deal that we do, and we do take carried interest, which means we get upside on the deals when they get an exit. Okay, so those are the two pillars, like commercially. So the flywheels are this. One is, as I've said already, on the investor network side, at scale, it's self-reinforcing, right? It just grows on its own. Number two is the programs. With the programs, 100% of people that go through the programs end up subscribing to our deal flow. So that becomes another channel
Yeah,
for
yeah,
investor acquisition.
yeah.
The third flywheel is the investment committee, right? Remember, we talked about on the education side,
Yeah.
there's the academic component and then the ongoing forum. Okay. Um, for the investors that are part of that forum, it's a way to learn and level up on their skills very quickly.
Yeah.
That is also strategic to us because we're basically building an inner circle. This is the brain of Angel School,
Okay.
right? And so this network ends up helping us sourcing deals, working on diligence, being a source of domain expertise on specific deals. And this lets us operate today in three regions, the US, Western Europe, and Southeast Asia.
Okay.
Meanwhile, as I've said earlier, I have no team. So the kind of footprint that we get from these pieces and how they connect and drive each other becomes super powerful.
Yeah. I mean, in effect, you've got three flywheels driving the growth of the business, haven't you? I mean, I can see that absolutely very powerful. One of the things I'm interested in though is in terms of dealing with people. I mean, I totally get your point about the kind of process piece, but in terms of people, I mean, doing business in Singapore very different to doing business in Germany in terms of attitudes, culture, and those kind of nuances. I mean, have you had to adapt much to those sorts of things?
Um, yes, to an extent, right? It's an interesting argument. I mean, cultural nuance has a very it's a very nuanced field. For what we do when we put out deals, I have a certain approach to the marketing and messaging, how I
Hmm.
describe the deal to investors. And I am very careful about being balanced, right? I don't like overselling anything,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's just not in my nature. But we always get into this where Yanks always think like, oh, you're not being bullish enough. And the Europeans
yeah.
think like, it
You're
feels a little
overdoing
bit
it.
pushy.
Yeah,
Exactly. I was
yeah,
like, well, I can only have one output. I can't, write this for
yeah,
everybody. Um, yeah, and you're right. There are cultural nuances. I'd say like it's a work in progress. I really don't have a clean answer. All we can do is go through the reps, right, and actually live this and breathe this and
yeah,
take the learnings along the process. The other nuance of working around the world with so many people and so many cultures is that this really is a community. It's not a company, as in, nobody reports to me. I'm not paying a salary. They don't have to be there, right?
yeah,
And I think that dynamic is also very different. You do want to get them engaged.
yeah,
We do want to be direct if they're wrong, right? Just because it's a good learning exercise. But in another vein, they're also clients or customers.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it makes managing the relationships interesting, I suspect.
Yes, it does, but I think the main persona that we work with are investors, and investors are relationship-driven creatures, and there's no getting around that.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I mean, what you've got is a big success now. Were there moments when it could have turned out differently when you look back on the journey?
Mhm. No, I don't know if it's a big success now. I think we're still building, and I'd still consider it early days.
Right.
Um,
It appeared to me to be successful when we've talked about it in the past. I mean, it struck me as a success.
well, thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, I think there's more work to be done.
Sure.
Um, Short answer is I guess no,
Right.
in a way that, I never set a certain milestone. I gotta like do A, B, and C, right? Everything was this evolutionary process, and to say like, okay, I'm just gonna take this step and then to figure out to let that define what the next step is and to go from there. As long as we see progress and it's progressing at a meaningful enough pace, then it suggests that we're on the right track.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know if it's the right or wrong way to look at it, but it's like it's been my approach. I think the other part of it was I've always been careful to de-risk, right? I'm not by nature a risk-seeking sort. I would characterize myself as risk neutral. I like to be balanced about the
Yeah.
decisions I take and which risks I take on. So, as an example of this, when I was building this for a lot of the early years. I was had a job, had a corporate
Yeah,
career, had a salary, and it was a way. It's the best of all setup to be building while you have a safety net,
yeah,
right? And so that allowed me to time the exit and to manage risk that way, which I think is also an important lesson, right?
yeah.
Because a
I
lot
mean,
of people.
it's very interesting you say that. I mean, because I'm a great believer that a side hustle, for want of another way of describing it, is a great way to start a business because you get to learn about things whilst you've still got a job giving you an income and all the rest of it. But in some quarters, it's among some founders. I mean, it's that sort of side hustle idea is looked down on, which I've always thought was a bit odd, really, because it seems to me it'd be a very good way to control risk.
I think so. I think that the side hustle situation, it logically makes sense when we articulate it, right, from a risk management perspective. But it's just exceedingly hard to pull off
Yeah,
just because when people have jobs and they're comfy, and after that, they just want to go watch Netflix and spend time with their mates at the pub and whatever it is. And it's very hard to find the discipline to
yeah,
stay on top of it.
yeah,
Uh, but it matters, and I just never wanted to be the bloke where I'm in this job, that I'm kind of meh about, and I'm in it for 10 or 15 years, and then suddenly you get made redundant or something, in your 40s or 50s. And it's like it's a hard knock to come back from,
yeah.
and you don't want to be building from then. You need to start doing it now.
Yeah. I also think it's a great way to learn those early lessons. I mean, that was my experience. My first business was a side hustle, and it was a very powerful experience. I mean, it worked reasonably well, but I learned a huge amount from it. And that was for me the most well, I made some money when I sold the business, but it was the learning that I got from it really that was the most powerful part of the experience, which is perhaps why I agree with you. When you look back on that journey, are there other big things that you've learned? I mean, you've talked about balancing risk there. I mean, are there other big lessons you draw from the journey that you've been on?
Maybe a little philosophically, Paul, which is
Right.
for me personally, the big learning is one is whatever you want to do, you got to own that vision. You
Yeah.
cannot expect anyone to care more about your goals than you do. Even the people around you, they love you and they care, and I'm sure, but you cannot expect them to care, right? And so you've really got to take ownership and go for that. The second thing is just learning how broad the CEO skill set is.
Yeah.
Uh, when you go down this path, you gotta like do everything, right? You live and die by your execution, until you build a team and all of these things. And you really need to confront all of these things, even the stuff that you don't like to do. Don't like to do sales? Too bad. Go figure it out. You got to do it, otherwise you make no revenue. And I think it does enrich you, not just from like a skill set perspective, but it also is another level
Yeah.
of like just hardening yourself to just grind through problems.
Yeah. I mean, I always call it the chief everything officer rather than chief executive officer because you've got to learn to do everything. And personally, I found that I mean, it's a very difficult experience, but a very rewarding experience in terms of my own development and a very, as you point out, philosophically, a very powerful position to be in when you think, I know how the whole business works, even though I might have people doing things now. I know how the whole thing works. And that's actually really important in terms of how you guide a business, isn't it? Because if you don't understand bits of it, you can't really guide something effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've also taken that into my own mental models when we look at companies to evaluate. We often say this, it's a bit of a trope, really. We say, oh, the founder is the most important thing
Yeah.
in a startup. And often that's said in a rather trivial, romanticized way. I mean, I agree with the statement in general, but from the point of view that building a company is really, really hard. And I'm evaluating a lot of founders on, do you have what it takes
Yeah.
when it gets really difficult? When it sucks and everything's like going wrong. And there will be days like this.
Yeah.
Do you
And
have it in you?
how do you do that? Because it's very easy to say I'm looking for resilience. How do you assess that? I mean, just give us your take on that. Because every investor, pretty much that I've spoken to, says, I look for a good founder. Okay, nothing wrong with that. It's more difficult to work out who they are.
Yeah, exactly. And my answer to that is like you're ultimately relying on instinct
Yeah,
because the interaction period with the founder during that investment diligence process is limited. So you're working with a limited information constrained by a time span. And so another approach is actually how do you prolong the time and interaction with the founder?
yeah,
Which is to say, at some stage, it might be, hey, no, not no, but not yet. And
yeah,
let's stay in touch. And to stay, they do stay in touch. Or we use capital to prolong that relationship. In the early companies that I back, I might write a personal check. It's not ready for my investor network. I don't feel comfortable putting my stamp of approval on it, but I'll write a personal check. I'm willing to stake that much. And that gives us a way to prolong that interaction, right? To
yeah,
say, hey, after 12 or 18 months, did you get somewhere? Did you get to where you were going to be, right? And how did I evaluate over that time period? That's another way to make a better assessment, I think.
yeah, yeah. And let me just ask you about one quite controversial issue. Um,
Sure.
I mean, one of the things that's happened, certainly here in the UK recently, we had a report out, I think it was last year, which essentially suggested that the vast majority of investment went to male founders, not female founders. Um, do you have a view on why that might be happening? I know there's lots of stuff going on at the moment to try and change that, certainly in terms of what's happening here in the UK. Do you have a view on that perspective, just given what we were talking about what makes a good founder?
Yeah. Um, so that's an important topic. I think the answer to this is a more nuanced conversation because the knee-jerk reaction from most people when they look at that stat is they say, oh, well, they jump to conclusions, right? And like there is some truth to it, by the way, but then people also spin off what I consider to be half truths, right? They will
Yeah,
say things like, oh, female founders actually like have they're better investments just because they return higher returns or something, right? They show some data. But assuming that that data is correct, the fundamental problem is actually that female founders are mispriced. They
yeah,
receive lower valuation.
yeah,
That's where like the delta is. But yeah, going back to your question, why does this exist? I think that venture capital, as an asset class, it tends to be a very exclusionary industry. A lot of industries are. I think venture capital more than most.
yeah, yeah,
And so there's not a bit, quite a bit of self-selection in this. That the people that do get venture capital jobs professionally, by and large, they tend to be male, cis male, whatever. There's a stereotype around this, and people pattern match, and they end up backing more male
yeah,
founders.
yeah,
Um, and so that becomes a self-propagating pattern. For what we do at Angel School, my contribution to the ecosystem is that, what, I think anybody who wants to be an angel investor can, if they could afford it. I want to give them the skills to be successful.
yeah,
We also want to create diversity on that side of the equation because I think when you can do that by creating more and more diverse
yeah,
investors, this is how we bring balance,
yeah.
right? I don't believe in the 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 other end of the pendulum reaction, which is like some groups come out, whether right or wrong you agree. I don't think it's the right approach. They'll say we'll create like all female groups
Yeah.
backing female founders. Well, okay, that's not the answer either. I don't think.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean you want to address the core problem really, which is the mispricing. I mean, as an economist, I would agree with that. Let me ask you another question, slightly less controversial, but I
Sure.
want to just explore this. When you think about investing in companies that are scaling into multiple jurisdictions, I mean, the more jurisdictions you're in, the more risk you carry. As we've already talked about. I mean, if you're working in five different countries, you're carrying more risk than if you're just working in one, for obvious reasons. What's your take on that process and investing in companies that are, if you like, entering a higher risk part of their journey? And we all know that most businesses fail, so the risk goes up. I mean, what's your take on that component to the process?
Yeah. I don't necessarily agree with the statement that the more markets that you enter, the more risk
Right.
that you're in. I mean, you could also make the argument that you are also getting diversification, which is actually technically de-risking.
Hmm.
But I think the crux of the question comes down to execution, right? Your ability to crack a particular new market. And again, it's, I don't mean to be wishy-washy, but it's a nuanced answer, right? Because I
Yeah.
look at companies from the US to Western Europe to Southeast Asia, and I see the differences in the hurdles of scaling to many markets. In the US, you have the benefit of a single currency, single language, and one economic system. We go to Europe, where there effectively is like the UK and the European Union. And the UK itself, generally speaking, could be a big enough market. Or the companies that are operating in the EU, there's some barriers to scale. I'm not super in touch with it, but I know that there are some cultural nuances and language differences and things like that. But you still have the underpinnings of a single economic operating zone and a currency versus seeing it in Southeast Asia, where going where and this is like the difficulty in Southeast Asia. In order to be a big enough venture scale company, they often have to be working in multiple countries
Yeah.
at the same time. And so in Southeast Asia, that basically involves setting up a whole new business in a whole new country, right?
Yeah.
And like the hurdles get much, much higher.
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting
yeah,
you say that. I've always thought that that was one of the big challenges there. And of course, you've also got in lots of cases you've got quite high levels of corruption that can you can encounter because they haven't got a standard kind of rule set in the way that you have across Europe or across the US. I mean, I know there are variations across, but there's much more variation in places like Southeast Asia, which has struck me as a really big challenge for people that are wanting to scale in those areas.
absolutely, right? You get tripped up over the smallest things,
Yeah.
right? Just like a local director requirements. To set up a company in a new country, very commonly in Southeast Asia, it's like you've got to have a local shareholder and he holds 51% of the company shares. It's like, who do you trust to
Yeah.
have control of your books?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I would find that a step too far probably, but yeah. And when you think about the business, I know you're not yet done with it, if you see what I mean. I know you've got a fair way to go. I mean, what are you proud of? What are you most proud of so far?
Um, I'd say that we are number one is we are proving that what we're doing is working,
Right.
right? And that leads to the second point, which is the scale of our impact. Through our programs today, we've impacted around 300 investors in 40 different countries.
Wow.
Angel School as an organization is completely bootstrapped. I've never taken a dollar of funding. So we've effectively built today a six-figure P&L bootstrap.
Wow.
Furthermore, I have literally no marketing budget. Our program sales and all the interest and the lead generation comes from word of mouth.
Yeah.
It's all referrals based. And I think that's a function of two things. One is the product is really, really good.
Yeah.
Second, there's trust. And when the investors know me and they go through this and they trust me, that like is worth more than its weight in gold, right? I mean, that, when our investors who are effectively clients are vouching for what we do to their friends, right? That is like so powerful,
Yeah.
and that I'm proud of.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And of course, trust is at the core of business, isn't it? I mean, no trust, no business, really. So it's a
Yeah,
pretty powerful thing.
absolutely.
Pretty powerful thing. And is there anything when you look back, is there anything you that you know now that you wish you known right at the beginning?
Yeah, I think I wish I was a little bit more aggressive
Oh,
in
really? Wow.
pushing the
What makes
message.
you say
Yeah.
that? Why do you say that?
Um, well, I guess in the sense, Paul, that I've tried to be quite methodical and deliberate in what I do, and I think there's a balance, right? So, at what point am I being too conservative? So as an example, how do we approach pricing? Right? I'm not a commercial expert. I never designed anything from scratch and sold it in my life, and so I think that in the early days when we went out to market with our programs, we just underpriced it,
Right.
and effectively means that we're leaving money on the table. It's important not just for financial well-being, but it just means that it's more capital that we can invest in other things.
Yeah.
Right. So you take a program like what we have, something called Venture Fundamentals. We've actually increased the price point by 2.5 times since the launch in 18 months
Wow.
without seeing any meaningful attrition in conversion. Right. Which basically suggests to me that in the early days, I was just way too conservative about launching that.
Yeah.
So it's things like that I wish I knew in hindsight, but then again, it's not they're not, it could be a lot worse.
Yeah, yeah, and to an extent, they're things that you have to learn, aren't they? I mean, that's part of what being in business. I mean, my view about business is that it's a never-ending sort of learning journey, really, because there's always something that you can improve on, which means there's always something to learn about. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm just all about execution
yeah,
and efficiency in the system, right? And I always trying to figure out, okay, what do we do more like
yeah,
squeeze a little bit more output out of this?
yeah. Sure, sure. And if you were to offer advice to somebody that might be starting on a journey like yours, but they're at the beginning, I mean, what advice would you offer to people?
Yeah. Just touching on some of the points that we discussed here today. Number one, uh, price risk the right way, right? So be able to separate between psychological risk and existential risk and just take a chance.
Yeah,
Second, and I agree with you philosophically, have the discipline to side hustle, like de-risk the execution on something before you jump full-fledged in. And the third is just own your mission. Don't expect anybody else to.
yeah.
And just take a swing at it. What's the worst that could happen? You know, you failed, but you tried. But you know what? Now that there's something that doesn't work. And I think in life, we don't always have to know what we want to do, but it is damn helpful to know what not to do.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That is a very good point, actually, Jed. Thank you for sharing that journey. I mean, it's been fascinating, and I mean, I'm really impressed with what you've achieved, actually. I think it's a fantastic model. And I really like the way you're reshaping an industry which is full of a lot of people that obviously already have a lot of knowledge, but you're bringing people something really new and useful and innovative to the table, which will really help people. So it seems to me to be a really fantastic proposition. So thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing the story. And good luck. I mean, I'm sure our paths will cross again soon, and I'm sure things will be going exceptionally well. So I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Paul.
Cheers, Jed. Bye bye.